Good evening. Tonight we are going to discuss how Gnostics can best respond to world and national tragedies. Our guest tonight is Chris Rooney. He's an activist, a lapsed Catholic worker, a ceremonial magician, and also a member of the Apostolic Johannite Church. Welcome, Chris. How are you this evening?
I'm good. Thank you, Ken. How are you?
Good. I think this is going to be an interesting topic, considering the date today. Today's the September 10th. Tomorrow's 9/11. I think any of us can remember in recent history the events that happened on 9/11, and I think probably a pretty good lead-in into how us Gnostics can kind of respond to kind of the events that we see happening in our own country and the world. How you doing, Bishop Peterson?
I'm doing awesome, Bishop Canterbury. Good to see all of you tonight. I was thinking about this topic, and I actually was the person who suggested it because we have had just an incredible amount of news. We've touched on that in our programming, Bishop Canterbury, but there's been bad news here and overseas, and it seems like sometimes with the media, we're surrounded by media these days, and it just keeps on coming, and we're a lot more aware of the horrors that go on around us. And I thought it'd be interesting for us to discuss how we as Gnostics, who have a very strong suspicion of the world and how it operates, might best respond to these events. And part of this was triggered last year when the Trayvon Martin verdict was released. And obviously Facebook kind of exploded. And one of my friends, a very dear man who is also Gnostic clergy, advised people to hug their families and to pray tonight for peace and that sort of thing. And I shared the status. I thought it was very well written. I shared the status on my Facebook page, and somebody else on my Facebook friends list just exploded and said, "No, this is not how you handle these situations. The prayer is not going to do any good, and we have to have activism, and we have injustice going on." And I was like, okay, all right then. But I think that for a Gnostic, there probably are other ways or alternative ways of addressing and responding to world tragedy, a national tragedy, that kind of can bridge that chasm between the spiritual and how we have to operate in a fallen material cosmos, which is why I wanted to bring our wonderful guest, Chris Rooney, on the show, because Chris, in addition to being a mystic and a ceremonial magician and a Gnostic, also has a strong history of activism. And in fact, he spent a great deal of time with the Catholic worker movement, which I consider to be a real kind of a third way approach to dealing with social issues. So welcome, Chris. And can you tell us a little bit about your activism? And I know that it took a while for you to come to Gnosticism, but do you see places where your experience, say, for example, the Catholic workers, intersects with your spiritual practice now?
I do a little bit, yes. I've been giving this some thought since I was invited to come on the show. And I think the intersection happens, for me anyways, with the writings of William Stringfellow, particularly. And Stringfellow was a lay theologian in the Anglican tradition and a friend of Daniel and Philip Berrigan. And he actually hid the Berrigans when they were on the lam in the 60s. But he wrote a book called An Ethic for Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land.
Great book. I've been reading it.
It's a wonderful book.
You told me about it.
And I did. He puts forward this idea that institutions can have a degree of sentience. And in the past, you guys have had shows on Egregores and Archons, and I think both of those are relevant topics in this context, because the egregore of an institution can be archonic in some senses. So, for instance, like the Bank of America could be considered an archon, or
Mm-hmm.
the military-industrial complex is definitely an archonic institution. Anything that is, to my mind, anything that is anti-life, anti-human, is fundamentally archonic. So, in that respect, I agree with your friend Lainey on Facebook, who said that praying isn't enough. I wouldn't say that prayer is useless, but I would say that in order to effectively witness, we have to act for justice.
Mm-hmm.
That you can light candles all you want, but until you take those candles out into the street, they aren't going to start a blaze.
Very well
Interesting.
put.
We have similar discussions, even like last week. One of the things, especially in our podcast of Talk Gnosis After Dark, one of the things that constantly comes up is the idea of that we must be performers of the work. It's one thing to give lip service to something; it's something else to actually be doing the work. And I think that what you bring up, Chris, is a good, valid point. It's one thing to sit there and pray for peace and pray for wisdom in certain situations, but it's another thing to actually go onto the streets, like I said, burn the candles. Actually make it known when injustice is served, and somehow to do something to try to kind of turn that around. I think the work is important on multiple levels, not just sometimes on a purely esoteric level, but sometimes right here on the physical plane.
Mm-hmm.
I know we talk a lot, Chris, you and I have talked about the importance of spiritual practice. And how do you feel about the idea that our spiritual practice helps to form us such that we can be far better change agents in the world?
Ideally, I agree with you that is the purpose of theology. Theology is it's a philosophy of change. It's something that you apply to your life, you apply to your surroundings and your situation. It's not simply a hermeneutic that you use to interpret scripture. I mean, it can be, but then it just can degenerate into sophistry. Unless you allow your philosophy or your theology to inform your action, then you end up doing just that, paying lip service.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking a bit about the archonic powers. Sometimes it becomes very difficult when we're faced with these monumental crises, such as in what's going on in the Middle East right now, where it doesn't appear like there's any one good solution. Different sides of this issue and different approaches and the different warring factions. Nobody, and for the most part, is a pure victim. There's no real good guys. Do you think that some of that is the result of archonic thought that doesn't allow us to think beyond this kind of bad guy, good guy, and we take one set of actions to try to neutralize the bad guy, but that only creates multiple more bad guys? Do you think that's that's a result of an archonic way of thinking, which is restrictive and blind in many ways?
In a sense, yeah, I think I could get behind that. The U.S. government particularly is good at creating monsters, it would seem. Al-Qaeda, for instance, had been funded by the CIA during the 1980s in the first Afghan war. Now, ISIS apparently was funded by the U.S. government to defeat the Bashar Assad, I think. I should back up a bit and say that I'm not a professional expert in foreign policy or anything like that, so I could have my facts wrong. But it does seem that the foreign policy of the American military and by extension, I think the global North is geared towards just that, creating monsters in the Middle East and proxy states and stuff, and it gets really messy.
I know that it's an area of incredible frustration. Again, being surrounded by this wall of media and not having, you know, one response to this, because it seems like, as I said, every time something gets quelled or neutralized, 5 more pop up. And I'm wondering, is there anything, for example, that Gnostics can do to influence? I mean, I don't know. Is there anything that we can do to influence foreign policy at all? And I don't know that there is. But is it possible for Gnostics to possibly develop and form ourselves so that to the point where we're able to think beyond the box created by the archonic powers? I mean, Dorothy Day had a radically different approach. The founder of the Catholic Worker, for those who don't know, took a radically different approach. I mean, she was a socialist for many years, and she you know, had a Catholic conversion or reversion, but she took a very different approach, and has had an enormous influence. And I'm wondering if that's the sort of thing that has to happen. Enough people have to form themselves so that they can say, we need to stop thinking like this and creating more monsters.
I think that you're touching on something that I've been thinking about for some time, which is the notion of not taking the scripture literally, but taking it personally.
Ah, I like that.
And also, one of my favorite quotes by Dan Berrigan: "Don't just do something, stand there."
We talk about the word stand a lot. It comes up a lot in the Gospel of Thomas, isn't that right, Bishop Canterbury? And we've talked about the importance of that. And one of the things that Bishop Canterbury brought up is that standing is actually a developmental stage. You know, when babies are able to pull themselves up and stand on their own, that's a major developmental milestone. So when you bring up about standing there, with what Daniel Berrigan had to say, that really rings true for me. The idea of standing there, and I think that you've really hit on something with tying these together.
I think that as Gnostics, one thing we can do is get active and go out into the street. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily specifically with an evangelical kind of agenda, but in the spirit of the scriptures we hold, that that we are there to engage dynamically with these archonic forces. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to take militant action, but it does mean that our presence is required. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking from my own personal experience. A number of years ago, I went to the Jonah House Peace Community in Baltimore, Maryland, and held a vigil in front of the Pentagon against nuclear weapons on Nagasaki Day. And we didn't do anything except stand there with banners and, obstructed some people getting into the building, but it was the act of being present that I think more than anything was an act of engagement with that archonic power, which is embodied by the Pentagon.
And you were also a disruptor. I mean, we hear the term disruptor a lot today when it comes to technology and new kinds of services, but you also disrupted people's day by standing there. Mm-hmm. You know, you weren't violent, but you stood, and therefore you disrupted, and something might have just slightly broke in the archonic prison. Maybe.
If it caused one individual to think, even for half an hour, about the ethics of what they were doing in that building, then I consider it a success.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the things, though, that I will throw in is that we've been talking so much about, you know, being activists and things. And one of the things that you first brought up, Bishop Peterson, was, you know, how you were kind of beaten down by one of your fellow people on Facebook for basically saying, let's come into prayer. As a Gnostic, I will say that the power of prayer can be powerful. For those of us who do practice ceremonial magic or theurgical arts, that there are many esoteric organizations out there who specialize in the idea of healing, and focusing one's energies towards the healing of the earth. I mean, one of the organizations I belong to, it's one of our regular practices, is kind of this idea of focusing up our energies about healing of the earth. And I will argue till I'm blue in the face or dead, that is not a wasted practice. You know, if we can get all of our brethren focusing our energy towards these types of things, I think that can help to manifest things on the earth. Now, I do believe that things have to go hand in hand. You know, things, as Chris mentioned, you know, sometimes holding a banner, standing in one's ground. But I think that also in this must come great wisdom. You know, sometimes I see, and you see it and I both see it, people who become very polarized, you know, very much on the right or very much on the left, and nothing ever gets accomplished because there's so much of this going on, instead of coming together trying to work for solutions that can be good solutions. On that note, I think we're going to have to continue this on to Talk Gnosis After
We
Dark.
are, and I want to thank our guest, Chris, for coming on the show, and he'll be joining us for the After Dark podcast. We do have an audience question. If you have been watching this, does your faith inform your activism? Let us know about it in the comments. Also, I want to remind everybody, as Bishop Canterbury mentioned, we're moving on to record our After Dark podcast, which can be downloaded at talkgnosis.gnosticnyc.com. You can also download it on iTunes or on Stitcher. Some people, though, get to actually watch the recording of After Dark, the After Dark podcast, and they do that because they support us financially through Patreon. If you are interested in supporting the program, you can go to Patreon, patreon.com/Gnostic, pledge a small amount per video or podcast, and yes, you can cap the amount you contribute each month, and it directly supports the development of this program, and we certainly do appreciate our supporters and our viewers as well. Also, something that has been in the news this week that we wanted to bring up briefly, and that is the issue of domestic and intimate partner violence. This is something, an issue that affects a lot of people. It affects men, women, genderqueer individuals. Anybody can be an abuser. Anybody can be a victim. If you are afraid or intimidated, there is help available, and you can contact the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also go to the website, although I will remind you that your web browser history can be checked, but if you have a safe computer, you can go to www.thehotline.org. There is help available for you. If that is an issue for you, and again, violence does not necessarily have to be physical. It can be sexual, it can be emotional abuse, it can be financial abuse. There are many different kinds of abuse, but there are people out there that can help you. So if you need help, please reach out and get it. Also, I want to remind everybody that we do appreciate your feedback. You can certainly comment on the video on YouTube. You can visit our Facebook group or send us an email at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. And we've got a great show coming up next week. Bishop Craig Williams, also known as Tal Lazarus, is the author of Cave of the Numinous, which is kind of, I guess, a book about yoga and Gnosticism and left-hand path stuff, and it sounds really, really juicy. So I'm looking forward to having him on the show, and I'm sure it's going to be a great one. So please do join us next week. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we're going to go into After Dark now, but we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.